There is something sitting in the tea aisle of your grocery store right now. It costs less than $4. And the research coming out of neurology journals in the last 2 years suggests it may be one of the most targeted, evidence supported things you can put in your body to slow down the very process that leads to Alzheimer's disease. And almost nobody is talking about it the right way. Most people think of green tea the way they think of vitamins, something generally good for you, something their grandmother drank, something they'll get around to eventually. But what I want to show you today is different. Because what's inside a cup of quality green tea, specifically one compound called EGCG, does something inside the aging brain that, when I first read the research, made me sit back from my desk. It physically crosses into your brain, it finds the immune cells that are misbehaving, and it tells them to stand down. I'm going to explain exactly what that means and why it matters so much more after the age of 60, but I need you to understand something first. Something most people, including most doctors in a general practice setting, have never fully explained to you. I'm Dr. Laura Chen. I'm a neurologist. I've spent over 15 years in clinical practice watching patients come to me with the same complaint described in 100 different ways. I can't find my words like I used to. I walked into a room and had no idea why. I'm not myself. And by the time they're sitting across from me, the process that brought them there has often been building for a decade or more. Today, I want to talk about what that process actually is, what is happening inside the brain as it ages, why inflammation is at the center of it, and why the compound in green tea, EGCG, which stands for epigallocatechin 3, gallate, has become one of the most seriously studied natural molecules in Alzheimer's prevention research. I'm going to walk you through three things: what neuroinflammation actually is and why it accelerates after 60, how EGCG works against it at the molecular level, and exactly what the research says about how much green tea, what kind, and when to drink it for maximum benefit. And I'll tell you about a patient of mine, I'll call her Dorothy, whose story I think about every time this conversation comes up. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine your brain has its own immune system, a private security force that lives inside the brain tissue itself. These cells are called microglia, your brain's resident immune cells. Under normal circumstances, they are extraordinarily useful. They patrol your neural networks, they clear out debris, they respond when something goes wrong. They are, in every sense of the word, your brain's protectors. But here's what happens as you age. And this is the part I need you to hear carefully. After 60, something shifts. These microglial cells, your brain's security force, they don't retire, they don't slow down, they actually become overactive, hypervigilant. The research describes it as a state of chronic low-grade neuroinflammation, meaning your brain's immune system is in a constant low simmer of activation that never fully switches off. Think of it like a car alarm that won't stop going off even when there's no threat. The alarm itself begins to cause the damage. It releases damaging proteins called cytokines, pro-inflammatory messengers like TNF-alpha, IL-1-beta, and IL-6. Research published in neuroscience journals has confirmed that these specific inflammatory markers are elevated in the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid surrounding the brain of Alzheimer's patients, and that they increase as the disease progresses. These cytokines damage synapses. They impair the brain's ability to clear amyloid-beta, the sticky protein that clumps into the plaques we associate with Alzheimer's. They don't just irritate the brain, they accelerate its deterioration. And I'll be honest with you, this process doesn't start the day you get a diagnosis. It starts years, sometimes a decade, before any symptom appears. That is why what I'm about to tell you matters right now, not later. EGCG is the most abundant polyphenol in green tea. It is a compound that, at this point, has been studied in multiple peer-reviewed journals, from Frontiers in Nutrition to the journal Antioxidants to PMC reviews published in 2024 and 2025, specifically for its role in brain protection. Here is the piece that changed how I think about this. EGCG has been proven to cross the blood-brain barrier even at very low concentrations. MDPI, that phrase, crosses the blood-brain barrier, is not a small thing. Most compounds we put in our bodies never make it there. The blood-brain barrier is one of the most selective filters in human biology. It is designed specifically to keep foreign molecules out of the brain. The fact that EGCG passes through it at concentrations achievable from drinking tea is what makes it clinically interesting to researchers like me. Once inside the brain, EGCG has been found to modulate microglial activation, reduce neuroinflammation, suppress pro-inflammatory cytokines, and decrease oxidative stress. Let me translate that from scientific language into what it actually means. It finds those overactive microglial cells, the alarm that won't stop ringing, and it modulates them. It doesn't shut down the immune system, it rebalances it. It brings those hyperactivated cells back toward a calmer, more regulated state. Research has shown that EGCG was able to suppress the expression of TNF-alpha, IL-1-beta, and IL-6, the specific inflammatory signals we see elevated in Alzheimer's patients, and restore the levels of intracellular antioxidants in microglial cells. Does that mean EGCG treats Alzheimer's? No, and I want to be honest with you about that. I'll come back to the limitations in a moment because they're important. But what the research tells us is that EGCG works against the specific biological mechanism that contributes to Alzheimer's pathology, chronic microglial overactivation, and the inflammation it produces. It addresses the fire, not just the smoke. There is a second thing EGCG does in the brain that I want to walk you through because it connects directly to the amyloid question, the question most of my patients are really asking when they walk into my office. One of the defining features of Alzheimer's disease is the accumulation of amyloid-beta peptides. These are fragments of a larger protein that, in a healthy brain, gets cleared away. In an aging brain under chronic inflammation, this clearance system becomes impaired. The fragments accumulate, they clump. They form the plaques we see in Alzheimer's brain tissue on imaging. EGCG has shown promising neuroprotective effects in Alzheimer's disease by inhibiting amyloid-beta aggregation and reducing neuroinflammatory responses. It interacts with amyloid-beta peptides, preventing their oligomerization and neurotoxic cascade. Oligomerization, that's the early process of clumping, before plaques fully form. The neurotoxic cascade, that's the chain of events. Those early clumps trigger that kills neurons downstream. EGCG appears to interrupt that chain at an early stage. And there's one more mechanism I want to mention because patients rarely hear about this. EGCG also promotes the non-amyloidogenic processing of amyloid precursor protein, reducing amyloid-beta peptide production. In other words, it doesn't only try to clear the clumps that have already formed, it appears to reduce how much of the problematic peptide is produced in the first place. That is a different conversation than drink green tea because it's healthy. That is a molecular argument for a specific compound targeting a specific pathway in the specific disease that most of my patients are afraid of. Now I want to come down from the molecular level and talk about what happens in the real world in large groups of real people who drink green tea over years and decades. Because this is where the story gets genuinely compelling. A 2025 meta-analysis of 18 observational studies, including a total of 58,929 people without cognitive impairment at baseline, found that green tea consumption was inversely associated with cognitive impairment, with the greatest benefit observed in people aged 50 to 69 years. 50 to 69. That is exactly the window we are talking about. That is precisely the audience I make these videos for. The years when the process is already beginning quietly, without symptoms, and when intervention has the greatest potential to change the outcome. In a separate prospective cohort study, individuals who consumed 2 to 3 cups of green tea daily had a significantly reduced risk of cognitive decline. That's a 44% reduction in risk. Not from a pharmaceutical drug with a list of side effects, from a beverage. And there's more. A large study of 8,766 community-dwelling participants found that higher green tea consumption was significantly associated with fewer cerebral white matter lesions. White matter lesions damage to the brain's communication pathways are directly linked to vascular dementia and Alzheimer's progression. Fewer lesions means healthier signal transmission between regions of the brain. It means cleaner wiring. The researchers concluded that drinking green tea, specifically 3 or more cups per day, may help prevent dementia through this pathway. Let me tell you what I actually tell my patients when this conversation comes up in the clinic, because there's a right way and a less effective way to do this. First, the type of tea matters. Not all green tea is equal. The compound we've been discussing, EGCG, is most concentrated in high-quality loose-leaf green tea, particularly Japanese varieties like matcha and sencha. Matcha is especially potent because you're consuming the whole powdered leaf, not just steeping it. Bagged green tea from the grocery store contains EGCG, but at lower concentrations. Second, how you brew it matters. Do not pour boiling water directly onto green tea. Boiling water degrades polyphenols. Let your water cool to about 160 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature where the color on a thermometer sits between hot and boiling before steeping for 2 to 3 minutes. This preserves the EGCG content. Third, the research data points most consistently toward 2 to 3 cups per day as the range associated with benefit. More is not always better. Studies found no significant additional benefit at 4 or more cups per day. All's discovery and high-dose EGCG supplements have been associated with elevated liver enzymes in some individuals, so I want to be careful here. Whole tea in moderate amounts remains the safest and most studied approach. I call this the brain inflammation morning ritual. 2 cups of high-quality green tea before noon, steeped properly, not scalded, consistent, not occasional. That's it. Simple, sustainable, backed by research. I want to tell you about a patient of mine. Her name was Dorothy. She was 64 when she first came to see me, a retired librarian from Virginia who had spent 40 years surrounded by books and ideas and had a mind I genuinely admired, sharp, curious, self-aware. She came to me because she was forgetting titles. Not just the author's name, the title of books she had read twice. She told me she'd been standing in front of her own bookshelves for 10 minutes, running her fingers across the spines, feeling like she was looking at strangers. After her evaluation, I told Dorothy honestly what I tell many of my patients at that stage. There was no diagnosis, no pathology on imaging, but there were early signals worth taking seriously. We talked about sleep, about exercise, about diet, and we talked about green tea not as a cure, but as one piece of a pattern of care that the evidence supports. Dorothy came back a year later. She told me the forgetting hadn't stopped completely. She knew it wouldn't. But she told me something else. She felt like her thinking had more grip. That was her word, grip. Like her thoughts were sticking to something instead of sliding away. I can't prove that was the green tea. Neuroscience doesn't work that way, and I'd never tell a patient it does. But I can tell you that she came in doing everything the research points to, consistently, seriously, without shortcuts. And I think about Dorothy every time someone tells me they've been meaning to start drinking green tea. Meaning to start, while the process, quiet and invisible, is already underway. I want to ask you something directly. Which part of what I shared today surprised you the most? Was it the idea that EGCG physically crosses into your brain? That chronic inflammation may be silently building for years before any symptom appears? Or was it the statistics nearly half the risk in real people over years of follow-up? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're already drinking green tea, tell me how you drink it. I want to know. Everything I've shared with you today is grounded in current neuroscience research and my own clinical experience. It is general medical information. It is not a substitute for your personal relationship with your own physician, especially if you are managing liver conditions, taking medications, or have been told to avoid caffeine. This is not me being cautious for the sake of a disclaimer. This is me meaning it. Green tea is not a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. It is one tool in a larger picture of brain health that you build consistently over years. I want you making those choices with your doctor's full knowledge and input. That's not a formality. That's the same advice I give to the people I care about most.